Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to Lecture 11 in Politics of Religion. And the purpose of this lecture is to look at a variety of issues around the theme of parties, voting and democracy. And I am going to admit from the beginning that parties and voting are amongst the, if not the most boring topics in the whole of political science. Now, some of you may be sitting here thinking, I'm really into parties and voting. That's okay. You know, you're allowed to be weird. But I think for most people, there's just not the thing that people, study politics to get into, right? However, so I completely buy all of that. If you're sitting there thinking, well, this is going to be a great 50 minutes. I didn't realise the lecture was on, and now it's on, parties and voting. Wow, okay. That's true, right? But I also think that when you add, I think this is common for a lot of things, actually, when you add religion into the mix, it suddenly becomes a bit more interesting. So hopefully this won't be quite as dull as I imagine you're imagining it's going to be. Even though, there's only so much you can do with this topic, right? So this is what I'm going to be talking about. This is the plan. And it is going to be something of a whistle-stop tour. So I do have quite a lot of stuff to race through. And, well, as you can see, I'm going to start off by talking about the rise and fall of Christian democracy in Western Europe. Then I'm going to talk about Islamist parties in Muslim-majority countries. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about the links between religion and voting in the United States. And then finally, I'm going to look at the more general theme as to whether, the debate around whether or not religion and democracy are compatible. That's basically what I'm going to be doing. So we start off then with Christian democracy. And immediately, this brings us to a mildly interesting paradox. Because as we know, Western Europe, well, we talked about this in term one, right? We were going over the debate around secularization, the decline of religion. And as we know, Western Europe is the least religious area on the planet. If you were to stack them all up, you'd have Africa, South Asia, East Asia, Latin America, North America, whatever. Western Europe would be the one, maybe the Arctic would probably be worse, but for now at least. But then, Western Europe would typically be the least religious part of the world. So why is it then that the most successful political party model in the democratic era in Western Europe has been Christian democracy? That, on the face of it, doesn't make any sense. Why would the least religious part of the world have Christian democracy as being the most successful political party model? How do we account for this? Well, okay, here's the story. Christian democratic parties. This is the abridged, very compressed story. Christian democratic parties emerged after the Second World War. They were the successors to a number of very small, sort of grassroots-led Catholic political parties that emerged in the pre-war period, were never very successful and never really had the approval of the church to be doing this sort of thing. But anyway, they kind of set themselves up as Catholic parties, didn't really go anywhere, kind of went by the by. But then after the war ended, a new series of parties were established that called themselves expressly Christian democratic. And they were based on a number of elements. I'm going to break it down to 4 core themes. The first thing that Christian democratic parties focused on was support for liberal democracy and renouncing any support for authoritarianism. This was quite significant because the Catholic Church had got itself in a bit of a muddle, shall we say, with a few of those guys from, the wartime period. I'm sure you all know who I'm sort of thinking about, right? Generally with a movement that started with the letter N. So, they were quite keen to sort of break away from all of that. So there was a renunciation of authoritarianism. Although, interestingly, the Catholic Church itself did not commit to supporting liberal democracy until the mid-1960s. There was a big Catholic get-together called the Second Vatican Council, where they went over and revised all their doctrines and tried to sort of bring the Catholic Church into the modern world. And only then did they accept formally liberal democracy. But Christian democratic parties were sort of ahead of the curve on this. So accepting liberal democracy, opposing authoritarianism, and particularly, now of course the war has ended, we've got the onset of the Cold War, and you've got the rise of communism. So Christian democratic parties set themselves up as the bulwark against communism. That was all point number one. The second theme was that they were strongly committed to processes of European integration. This obviously led to eventually the European Union. The process of European integration was driven largely by Catholic political leaders. Thirdly, and I hate to take you back to PO 107 again, but they were typical catch-all parties. If you remember Otto Kirchheimer with his catch-all political party model, right, designed to represent interests from across the political spectrum. Well, they were basically trying to do this, right? They adopted the politics of pluralism, tried to appeal in a sort of umbrella-style political fashion to a range of classes and a range of sectors, trade unions, employers, rural groups, urban groups, and so on. And this played a key role in the establishment of the post-war settlement. So the Catholic political parties, and again Catholic leaders, played a vital role in bringing about this post-war relationship between capital and labour, based on welfare states, Keynesian economic policies, a mixed economy, and corporatist relations between capital and labour. And finally, they also offered a moderated or watered-down form of religious identity. And this, I think, explains the paradox that I was talking about a few minutes ago, because Christian democratic parties did not use the Christian element of their identity as a direct political formula, right? There was no, what should the level of income tax be? Well, let's see what the Bible has to say about this, right? There was no kind of taking policies directly from Scripture. It was more a sort of Christian ethos that permeated their political standpoint. And so this then enables Christian democratic parties to have this umbrella-style appeal, right? They could present themselves as being Christian to Christian voters, right? If you're a Christian voter and you're looking for a Christian party, well, there you go. It's in the bag, right? But on the other hand, if you were a non-Christian or non-religious altogether, you could still vote for Christian democratic parties because they weren't going to promote an overtly Christian agenda. And this approach was highly successful. Here are just some of the Christian democratic parties in Western Europe that enjoyed political success during the post-war period. Don't try to write all these down, please. They're all on the slides which are available on Moodle. But as you can see, it was particularly strong in places like Italy and Germany, Austria, Belgium, Luxembourg. Less successful in places like Norway and Switzerland. It was a bit patchy there, but nevertheless did have periods of success throughout the post-war period. But by the 1990s, the Christian democracy then entered a sort of death spiral, and this was due largely to a change in the structural conditions that had allowed Christian democracy to flourish in the first place. And these are the main factors within which Christian democratic parties were embedded that changed, and that subsequently eroded their ability to make this mass appeal. So first of all, we've got the collapse of communism, right? And that's going to be a big problem. If one of your key political selling points is we oppose communism, right? If you oppose communism, vote for us, and then communism is gone, well, the bogeyman has disappeared, and people then have less of an incentive to vote for you. So the decline of communism took away one of the big selling points, one of the big raison d'etres of Christian democratic parties. Secondly, again, we talked about this before, secularisation, which means generally there are fewer religious voters to appeal to in European societies. Thirdly, we've also got a whole range of socio-economic and demographic changes bound up with, all of this is sort of something that affects the whole of Western Europe at this time, right? We've got the growth of sort of Thatcherite, Reaganite, neoliberal policies starting to seep into, seep across the continent. We've got the impact of globalisation, growing, increasingly elderly population, putting greater strain on welfare services, for example, makes the post-war settlement increasingly harder to sustain. And once that happens, then parties have got less of an incentive to commit themselves to having corporatist policy making. Once privatisation gets underway, you've got less of an incentive to try to make a mixed economy work. So all of these things also took the ground away, essentially, from Christian democratic parties. And then finally, we've got these processes which, again, are not unique to Christian democratic countries, but processes of party de-alignment. For example, generally people becoming less committed to voting for one particular party, the rise of the floating voter, an increasingly volatile electoral marketplace. And in this context, we also have the rise of new parties, particularly parties like the Greens, for example, or the New Right across other Western European countries. And so this poses a serious dilemma for Christian democratic parties. Which way do you go? You've got a very limited number of options at this point, right? How you can try to pick a way through this changing electoral landscape. You could, for example, move to the right and try to capture the more conservative voters. I mean, that's going to be okay, I suppose, but on the other hand, you're going to lose your catch-all appeal, right? And once you start to do that, and particularly when you do that in societies that have more proportional electoral systems, then, you know, you're in big trouble. Okay, that's not really going to work. What about moving to the left? Well, that's not going to work because most societies that had Christian democratic parties, they also had very strong social democratic parties, and they basically had the centre-left vote already tied up. So there's not much ground to be made by moving over to the left. And even in doing that, you have the opposite effect. As I previously mentioned, you're going to alienate everybody on the right. Okay, a third option then might be to emphasise your religious appeal. I mean, after all, you are Christian democratic parties. Why not make a bit more of that? Well, again, the problem is you're going to lose support from non-Christians. And in a part of the world where secularisation is now increasingly gaining pace by the time we get to the 1980s, 1990s, that seems like a really bad idea. So there were no good options for Christian democratic parties at this point, and they entered, as I say, this sort of death spiral. I apologise for this. This is a dumb slide. This is just therapy on my part for putting this up, so bear with me. But they're pretty much gone now, right? I mean, apart from the CDU in Germany, is really the only big Christian democratic party that still enjoys some kind of, periods in office, right? Apart from this, I mean, Italy, it's completely collapsed amidst the whole series of financial and sexual scandals, which of course is very Italian. But they've never really recovered from this. And so the Christian democratic era in Western Europe is effectively over by this point. Now, the question of integrating religious values with a modern democratic government is, of course, not limited to the Christian context, and we find a similar set of debates emerging in Muslim majority societies. And here, unlike Christian democratic parties, which have historically downplayed, as I say, the Christian element, right? It was more a kind of values ethos thing. In Muslim majority countries, parties have given religion greater prominence. And one reason for this, it's not hard to sort of see why, if we look at some figures, for support in Muslim countries for religious leaders becoming involved in politics, and more particularly, I'm going to come back to that right at the end of the lecture, but more particularly, support for Sharia law. Now, it is true, as you can see by using your own eyes, that support for Sharia law in Muslim countries is quite variable, right? In some places, it's pretty much non-existent. Azerbaijan, for example, it's just 8%. But then in a lot of places, you do get significant majorities. Pakistan, 84%. For example, Bangladesh, 82%. Tunisia, 56%. Obviously smaller, but still a plurality of the population. And so you have quite high levels of support for the general idea that law and politics should in some way be infused with religious values and religious ideas. And so this then might explain why parties in Muslim majority countries have leaned more closely on religion as being part of their selling package. And this is particularly useful for Islamist parties. Now, Islamist parties are usually defined as parties that want to introduce and implement Islamic law as the basis of governance, and they typically reject any idea of liberal democracy and secularism as being the basis of governance in their societies. And typical examples here, again, as you can see, include Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in Egypt in the 1920s and is now banned. We've got Hamas in Gaza, which I'm sure everybody knows about. Ennahda in Tunisia, for example, the AKP in Turkey, and so on. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, right? But these are some of the main examples that you're going to run into. Now, one thing that's important to bear in mind here, right, a slight sort of pause in the proceedings, because it's not always clear What makes an Islamist party? I mean, you've got the kind of general definition that I've just kind of given you, but it's not always obvious when you take a political party and you try to map it onto that particular definition, whether it fits or not. And some people will say, actually, this idea of Islamist parties is really quite vague and fuzzy. Do we use the term Islamist, or do we use the term, another one that comes up is religiously inspired, or we could use the term traditional or conservative. We run it this, by the way, let me just flag this up here. We get a similar thing when we come at the end of the module to talking about fundamentalism, right? That particular label. Other people will say you can use the label conservative or traditional or whatever, right? So there's a kind of a similar thing. So there is a debate around whether or not this term, Islamist parties, is actually useful. And in some cases, the AKP is another really good example. Some people will say the AKP is an Islamist party. Other people will say it's not. It's a conservative party, and exactly where you draw the boundaries between them is often, it's a subjective thing, right? So there's no consensus as to what counts as an Islamist party, and some people argue that even the very idea of an Islamist party is not particularly useful because, well, on the one hand, there's no single form of Islam in the first place. Islam is a widely heterogeneous religion. And secondly, there are wide interpretations as to what Islamic law can mean. So in the figures I just gave you, showing you support for a Sharia law around the world, people asked in those surveys will have wildly different views on what Sharia law is and on the extent to which it should be applied. Right, so you get a hugely contrasting range of opinions. And then so the idea then that you can within that put this framework and call it Islamist, and that's going to fit everything. I mean, some people just say that's, just stretching it a bit too far. And the success of Islamist parties, which is also interesting given the point I was making a few minutes ago about the general support for this sort of thing, is fairly limited, right? These are the notable examples. These are kind of the exceptions that prove the rule, right? These are the examples where Islamist parties have been successful in gaining political power. Muslim Brotherhood, again, top of the list, one of the main examples in Egypt in 2012. Gaza, of course, we'll know about the AKP from roughly the turn of the century right the way through to the present day. Tunisia, famously in 2011. However, many Islamist parties have really struggled to gain political influence and electoral support. And there's been a few studies into this. I'm just going to rattle through a couple of them. Here's one by Kurzman and Naqvi, which looked at 89 parliamentary elections in Muslim countries over a 40-year period, and they found that Islamist parties, on average, won just 7.3% of the vote and 6% of the seats. They're basically the Lib Dems of the Muslim world, right? Not particularly influential in political terms, which again, if you think about, as I was saying earlier on, the degrees of support, when people are asked, they say, yeah, I really want this thing, and then people come along and say, here's this thing you say you want, and then they don't vote for it, right? Seems a bit strange. An updated piece of research from Kurzman and Turkoglu, I'm sure you can read it better than I can pronounce it. But anyway, as you can see here, this was a follow-up, which was in 2015. This was taken after the Arab Spring, found that more than 80% of Islamist parties won less than 10% of the vote. And more than half of the Islamist parties in their study won less than 2% of the vote, which is pretty pathetic electorally, really. So how then do we explain this? Well, there are varying factors in play here, right? There's no one sort of single explanation. But here are some of the main things that come up in the literature. One is that Islamist parties tend to focus on welfare issues as part of their electoral appeal. Vote for us and we'll put more money into welfare, put more money in people's pockets, unemployment, poverty, we're going to deal with all of those issues. Which is great, right? But on the other hand, it is typically meant that they have put less attention and less emphasis on their economic policy programme. And of course, Islamist parties are likely to be more successful in parts of the world where their economic structures are less than robust. And so what has typically happened then is that when Islamist parties have gained political power, they've run into difficulties around the economy, and this has caused their popularity to take a hit. What then happens when their popularity takes a hit is that they tend to fall back on the religious side of their appeal and the authoritarian streak that they have, and they tend to go in this direction, clamping down on individual freedoms, which again undermines their support. Right now, okay, there's, as we know from being alive and seeing what's going on in the world, there is a non-trivial amount of people in any given population who are quite fond of this sort of thing, but most people aren't. And once you turn in that direction, again, it kind of erodes popular support. So you get the growth of authoritarian tendencies, and then you reach a certain point. I mean, this has happened historically in a number of examples: Algeria, 1992, Turkey, 1997, Egypt in 2013, when the military has then stepped in to overthrow the government, get rid of the Islamist party, and then restore democracy, eventually. So this is, some of the reasons why they've tended to have less than stellar political track records when they actually manage to get into office. Interestingly, though, alongside all of this, research also suggests that where Islamist parties engage in electoral politics, they have, like Christian democratic parties, started to liberalise and water down the religious side of their appeal, becoming more accepting of democracy, tolerance, pluralism, human rights, liberal freedoms, and so on, and then de-emphasising their religious aspects. Essentially becoming, there is a debate in the literature about whether or not Islamist parties can kind of cross over and become Muslim democratic parties. Right, we have Christian democratic parties based on catch-all appeals, very kind of centrist, and there are Muslim democratic parties that kind of do the same thing. And so there is a view which says once you put Islamist parties in a competitive electoral environment, they tend then to tack back from the more extremist parts of their policy platform and move towards the centre, because that's where the majority of votes are. Or at least were. Obviously, we're living in a very strange timeline where that doesn't necessarily appear to be the case anymore, but certainly it used to be. And so as you can see here, looking at these two diagrams, support for, this was looking at the policy platforms of Islamist parties. As you can see, support for Sharia law, support for jihad dropped over time, support for women's rights, minority rights, and democracy increased. I mean, you can obviously see it did go down again towards the end, but nevertheless, there is some evidence here to show that these platforms were liberalising generally. And, as Ali Salim notes, just sort of underlining the point here, Islamist parties of the past were now toning down their religious rhetoric to broaden their appeal. Now, one possible explanation for this is a thing called the inclusion moderation hypothesis. And this argues that taking part in electoral politics changes the incentive structure for more radical political parties, and it drives them, like I was saying a minute ago, drives them back towards the centre, drives them towards more consensual politics, more pragmatic political arrangements in order to try to win votes. But there's no agreement as to whether or not this actually works. Because it might look on the face of it, the diagrams I've just shown you, okay, that seems to be happening in some cases, and it sort of, makes logical sense. If you're an extremist party, you're only going to get the votes at the extremes, right? So you've got less chance of getting into government. So if your aim is to get into government, the centre is where you need to be. Okay, fine. But there is an argument to say, critics of this will say, all right, so when extremist parties moderate, they're faking it. Right? It's not a genuine commitment to pluralism, human rights, democracy, and all the rest of it. This is just lip service to get votes. And then once extremist parties get into power, they revert to type. And then all of that stuff goes out the window, as we saw with the Muslim Brotherhood in post-revolutionary Egypt, right? Which is, of course, why the army stepped in to kick them out. Another place where the inclusion moderation hypothesis seems to have a few issues is the United States, which of course is becoming increasingly extreme. I would say it's almost like, Weimar Germany with inflation, right? You'd kind of say becoming more extreme by the week. Now it's becoming more extreme by the minute, right? Every time you kind of go on the internet, it's like, oh my, that's enough of that for today. It's just absolutely crazy. And so a lot of the attention here, in terms of the relationship between religion and politics, has focused typically on the Christian right. Okay, now it's moved more in the direction of Christian nationalism, but for a long time it was focusing on the Christian right. And this is a political movement made up of conservative, predominantly white evangelicals there are other denominations in here as well. You do kind of get Catholics and Mormons and so on mixed up with this, but it's dominated by white evangelical Protestants. And it emerged during the 1970s. And one of the aims of, well, let me just, at this point, it might be useful just to draw a sort of distinction, right? Because obviously Christian nationalism is the new big thing. The Christian right, when they emerged in the 1970s, their aim was to infuse policies and the direction of government with what they saw to be Christian values, right? Christian nationalism takes the view that the country itself should be run by Christians, for Christians. They basically want to take over the government, right, and make the whole thing a kind of Christian Taliban. Whereas the Christian right didn't want to do that. They wanted policymakers to listen to them and basically follow their line in terms of Christian values, but they didn't actually want to take over and run the whole thing. And so we have the emergence of this movement from the 1970s, but this isn't really the beginnings of religious attempts to influence politics in the United States. Predates the 1970s. And I mean, one of the most famous examples of this is Prohibition, right, in the 1920s, which was driven by religious groups trying to impose, or get their particular values enacted. So there are examples of this before the 1970s, but it doesn't really get going until the 70s. And one of the reasons why they never really got their act together was because there was a series of schisms within the movement. Typically, Protestants and Catholics didn't get on, right? So the Protestant evangelicals were very sceptical of the Catholics. There was a lot of high levels of distrust. Catholics, for example, wanted state funds for their own schools, which Protestants disagreed with. They were also differed quite significantly on their stance towards abortion, which is something we'll come back onto later in the module. So there were these big, and there was a general, by the way, in the United States, distrust of Catholics, right the way through to Reagan. Reagan was seen to be like a watershed in this regard because he was a Catholic, right? And it's only really not Reagan, Christ, who's the guy? Kennedy. It's not until Kennedy comes along, because he was a Catholic, that then it could demonstrate it to people that you can be a Catholic and an American, right? And that had a big effect on levels of Catholic distrust. But until this point, you had these schisms between the two sides, and they didn't really, weren't able to work together until the 1970s come along. And at this point, again, it's a similar thing to what I was saying previously with Christian democratic parties, where the structural conditions under which they're operating shifted dramatically. And it was the same thing here. The opportunity structure for groups on the Christian right changed significantly from the late 1950s, 1960s, right? We're increasingly moving in this direction. So we've got the rise of the Cold War, for example, which drives this idea that America needs to define itself against communism. And one of the ways they do that is by using religion, right? So you have the godless commies on one side, and you have Christian America on the other side. This is when "In God We Trust" becomes emblazoned on the American currency, right? It doesn't happen before the Cold War. This is one of the reasons. It's this identification of defining America as being anti-communism. So that's all kind of playing into things. We also have, as you can see here, ban on prayer in public school in the early 1960s, abortion in the 1970s. There's a whole series of, American military escapades around the world which don't seem to be going particularly well. All of this creates the impression that America is and obviously the sexual revolution in the 1960s, right, with Woodstock and the pill and everything else, creates this generalized impression that America is facing an irrevocable moral decline, and the religious groups need to get their act together and work to stop it. And this provides largely the impetus for these groups to start working together and form what now becomes known as the Christian right. So we then end up with one of the more obvious features, of course, of the Christian right is that they're very, very closely attached to the Republican Party. This is also quite a new thing, right? It wasn't the case before the 1970s. Now, I think it's true to say that the evangelicals leaned more in the direction of the Republican Party, but a significant chunk of them voted Democrat, right? And one of the reasons why the Republican Party were able to scoop up the evangelical vote was the failure of Jimmy Carter as president, because Jimmy Carter wasn't evangelical. And the evangelicals thought, great, we've got our guy in the White House now, and he's going to start pursuing evangelical policies, he's going to start doing what we want. And he didn't. And so there was a massive kind of fallout from this, huge disillusionment with Carter. And then the Republicans came along and said, well, hey, look, we've seen what the Democrats are not going to do for you. Come to us. We'll give you what you want, right? So they started to make a much more overt electoral pitch to the evangelical electorate. And it worked. It was really, really successful. And they managed to bring people on board. However, the success of evangelicals in terms of getting religious policies enacted or getting religious values pursued in the policy frameworks, it has been quite limited until recently, obviously. I'm coming on to that. But until, he who should not be named came along, it was very, very limited. You could point towards, maybe there was a ban on research using human embryos, using stem cells from human embryos by the Bush administration, right? And there were a few faith-based initiatives, notably, again, by Bush, but that was kind of it. You couldn't point... the thing they wanted more than anything else was Roe v. Wade, right? That didn't happen. So it was all very, very limited, kind of piecemeal stuff until we get this angry chap. And since then, of course, Trump has made direct appeals to evangelicals and has delivered for them in lots of ways, right? I mean, this isn't an exhaustive list, but I'm sure, you can think of more things than these. We had an open, targeting Muslims with a travel ban. We've got moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, putting evangelicals in high office, like Betsy DeVos, for example, Mike Pence, before he decided that Pence didn't like him and, he should be kind of thrown under the bus. We also have religious exemptions for reproductive and gender rights, a whole swathe of anti-transgender policies, using Supreme Court nominations to swing the court in the direction of right-wing religious politics for at least a generation. We've got closing DEI projects. We've got an anti-Christian bias task force. We've got clamping down on immigration, and so on, and so on, and so on, right? A whole swathe of things that evangelical voters say that they want, and Trump comes in and says, vote for me and I'll give it to you, and that's exactly what he does. And for this, Trump has reaped the electoral rewards and has been strongly supported by people from the Christian right, particularly, as you can see here, white evangelical Protestants, an estimated 81% of which voted for Trump in the 2024 general election. Also a big swing uptick from Catholics from 47 to 56%. And notably here, as you can see, a huge drop in the proportion of the nuns who voted for Trump. So electorally, this pitch has been really quite successful. And the Trump presidency has also been notable for the rise of Christian nationalism, which I defined a few minutes ago, so I won't sort of run through all this again, but this has now been almost like the Christian right has now morphed into a more extreme version of itself. And, we can see this in lots of ways. Project 2025, for example, the January 6th insurrection, huge numbers of whom describe themselves, for instance, as Christian patriots. And so all of this then raises an obvious question, which is that, is religion compatible with democracy? In the United States, huge question marks hanging over this. But pulling the lens back and looking at it more generally, what does the debate on this issue say? Well, some people would argue that no, they're not. Right? As you can see here, Gersel argues that essentially religions are based on dogma, intolerance, prejudice, all those kinds of negative viewpoints, right? In and out group mentalities, all of those kinds of things, tending to violence ultimately. Again, we'll talk about this more in the later of the module too. And all of that is, the antithesis of democracy, right? You can't have a functioning democracy with those sorts of forces poisoning the body politic. Others, however, will argue that religious groups are a key part of a healthy and well-functioning democratic society. And the argument here is that in order to have a functioning democracy, you need to have non-political civic associations like charities or trade unions or religious groups, because they boost social engagement, they develop civic skills, they bridge gaps between different parts of the population, they promote political engagement, they do all of that stuff that we talked about in term one around social capital, particularly when it comes to bridging social capital. All of that is seen to be genuinely good for a democracy, and any functioning democracy would really do well to have it. and political groups are excellent at driving all of those things, religious groups, and so religious groups are therefore essential for the health of a democratic society. Now, one of the core themes of this debate, though, is that not all religions have the same sort of effect on democracy. And one of the big claims that you'll find in the literature, if you go kind of wandering around and have a look, is that Protestantism is said to be particularly well suited for democracy. And one of the reasons for this, as we noted last week when we were talking about the links between religion and free market economics, is that Protestantism is highly sectarian, and it has a very high level of emphasis on individuality. It's a very decentralized religion. There's no kind of centralization, globally within it. No hierarchical structures. A lack of sort of central authority, and all of this is said to make Protestantism conducive towards pluralism and tolerance, which again is, pretty good for democracy, right? And there is some empirical evidence to support this. So these are the latest figures, by the way. The 2025 report was using the 2024 data. This is from the Islamist Intelligence Unit. You can go and grab this stuff for yourself. This is their democracy index. And as you can see, if you just count down from the top, all but 2, this would be Ireland and Luxembourg, of the top 10 countries, these are the most democratic countries in the world, are Protestant. And probably if you count down for the whole of the list, it's roughly about half would be Protestant. In contrast, Catholicism in the literature is often said to be less compatible with democracy, because the institutions and structures of the Catholic Church are hierarchical, and according to critics will say this is, it's inherently, essentially authoritarian. Right? You have one person at the top, tells everyone else how it's going to be, and that kind of filters down through the organisation to the grassroots. Right? It's very, very centralised, very authoritarian, and as I noted earlier on, the Catholic Church has a less than pleasant record when it comes to acquiescing with certain, authoritarian regimes of the 20th century, notably those in Europe and also, of course, in the 1970s, Latin America. At the same time, though, critics of that particular line of argument will point out that, here's one particular point. The so-called second wave of democratization, which took place from the 1970s, was dominated by Catholic countries. Around about 2/3 of all the countries that embarked on the process of democratization during this time were Catholic. And if you go back to the list I was just showing you a moment ago, the kind of ranking, and you get the figures for yourself, of those top countries, the most democratic countries in the world, around about 25% of them are Catholic, which is not kind of what you'd expect to find if, there was an innate problem between Catholicism and democracy. So the argument for them being inherently incompatible doesn't really work. Another religion, this probably won't come as a surprise to you, which is often said to be incompatible with democracy, is Islam. And if you look at, again, these are the figures from the Economist Intelligence Unit. These are the highest ranking Muslim majority countries in the world. It's not particularly great, right? Malaya comes in at 44th. Indonesia comes in at 59. None of them, by the way, come in the category of full democracies. So they basically divide democracies into different categories, right? You've got full democracies, then you've kind of got flawed democracies, and I think you've got hybrid democracies, then you've got authoritarian systems, right? Not a single Muslim country in the full democracy category. And if we look at the lowest ranked countries in the list, again, this is sort of quite small, so you might need to squint a bit. 11 of the bottom 25 countries shown here are Muslim. And so one of the themes in the literature then is there exists a thing called a democracy gap in the Muslim world. And empirically, it's true, right? There is a democracy gap. That's what the data says. All the full democracies in the world are not Muslim, and the ones at the bottom tend to be concentrated around Islam. And there is this notable difference, right? There is a democracy gap in the Muslim world. The question is not, does it exist? Because it does. The question is, how can it be explained? Well, according to scholars like Samuel Huntington, Bernard Lewis is another one, for example. The problem is something to do with Islam itself. And for Huntington, this was explained through his Clash of Civilizations thesis, in which the world was divided up into a number of competing civilizations that were defined chiefly in terms of ethnicity and religion. And the key reason, and so the Islamic world, according to this hypothesis, was said to prefer authoritarian regimes rather than democratic governments with little or no support or respect for individual liberal freedoms and human rights. And the key argument for this was that Islam has no separation between religion and politics. It's a totalizing worldview. It provides an all-encompassing framework that wants to control all aspects of an individual's life. And that framework itself is by definition not compatible with liberal democracy, right? There is something about Islam and its all-encompassing nature that inherently makes it a terrible fit for democratic governance. And that's the kind of argument that you will find. However, the situation again is, this won't surprise you, I'm sure, not as straightforward as it's often portrayed. Here are some reasons why these sorts of arguments don't necessarily work. Argument number one is that, well, it's not always clear what we mean by democracy, right? This is one of those, which I'm not going to follow this line of argument, but there is a view which says, first of all, you have to define what we mean by democracy, right? And political scientists will define it in lots and lots of different ways. And so it might be that if you're talking about Western-style liberal democracies, then yeah, maybe Islam is not quite as compatible. But if you're talking about other forms of democracy, then, maybe it works a bit better. Now, I think this is a really weak argument. I don't like these sorts of arguments at all, by the way, just because I think it opens the doorway to all kinds of horrible regimes and all kinds of justifications for, doing horrible stuff. So it could be the case that somebody comes along, some authoritarian character, I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, genuinely wasn't, I am now, but I wasn't, starts to subvert democratic institutions, but then says, oh no, this is just another way of doing democracy, right? And anyone who's criticising me, that's just a Western criticism, and it becomes ethnocentric, right? And, I just think, well, that's just a terrible thing, because it just justifies people doing all kinds of nonsense. So I'm not a fan of this particular argument, but it's there, so, be aware of it. A second, and in my view, more substantial point here is that you can't really say that Islam is not compatible with democracy because there's no single form of Islam, right? And the Islamic world has a whole range of different relationships between politics and religion. We have obviously theocracies, places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, but we also have, secular, if flawed democracies in places like Malaya, Indonesia, Turkey, Tunisia, and so on, right? The idea that all these places have the same kind of framework, it just, doesn't really work. You're trying to homogenize a group of people that are more than 1.2 billion Muslims living in more than 50 countries across 3 continents, right? And then sort of saying that they all have the same view of religion and politics. It just doesn't really work. And of course, many of the world's leading democracies, like Western countries, the UK, for example, the USA, maybe not anymore, but certainly used to be, have got sizable Muslim majorities that have no problem whatsoever taking part in elections and playing their role in democratic politics. So the idea that there is something unique about Islam and that traverses the whole of the Islamic world that makes it incompatible with democracy, it doesn't necessarily stack up. Another problem why these sorts of arguments don't necessarily work is that there are a whole bunch of other reasons to explain the democracy gap in the Muslim world, right? Imperialism being one. So it's certainly true that Western countries have intervened in Muslim-majority countries and have themselves supported authoritarian regimes throughout their history. Iran is another really good example, right? The Shah of Iran, supported by the United States, right? Authoritarian character, clamping down on everybody, and the United States backed him up, right? So imperialism has distorted the political and economic systems in many Muslim-majority countries, which of course then means that, it becomes more difficult for those countries to embark on a process of democratisation because they're not starting from a very healthy position. Secondly, in a lot of countries, particularly, of course, in the Middle East, we have the problem of oil, sometimes called the oil curse, or the rentier state problem. And you may have encountered this, but just very, very briefly, what this essentially means is that if you have a country with a lot of oil, you can make a lot of money just by selling oil, and you can use that wealth to buy off or oppress disaffected parts of your population. You don't need to engage in consensual political strategies designed to gain a wide range of support across the country. You can simply buy people off. Right? You can throw money at the problem. And this, again, has a hugely distorting effect on democratic practices. And thirdly, well, the lack of development, of course, plays into this as well. There is an argument from modernisation theory to say that democracy kind of follows economic modernisation, and that as the economy itself develops, then you get a growing middle class. As you get growing middle class paying more taxes, they start to demand political representation, and so on. And the final one here is that this is a sort of, for the people who are arguing that there is something about Islam which creates authoritarian systems, well, it's also true that many of the most authoritarian systems in the Muslim world have been secular, right? And have banned Islamic movements that have opposed them, like Turkey or Iraq. Saddam Hussein, who was a secular government. Egypt, same thing, right? These weren't religiously motivated authoritarian systems. They were secular authoritarian systems. Research has also found, to stick with this point, no significant differences in attitudes towards democracy in people from Muslim countries and people in the West. In fact, some research has found less support for democratic ideals in other non-Western countries, typically in Eastern Central Europe, where Christian orthodoxy is the prevailing religion, right? They tend to have a lower levels of support for democracy than people in Muslim-majority countries. Also, Latin America, largely Catholic, lower support for democratic governance than many Muslim-majority countries. And we also find higher than average levels of support for, this goes back to the point I was making earlier on, about support for Sharia law, right? And the general idea that, well, maybe people in Muslim countries would like to have more religious authorities engaged in politics. We find higher levels of support in Greece and the United States for that, for having religious authorities involved in politics, than we do in many Muslim majority countries. And the final, this stuff here, by the way, I should have put on the slide, is from Norris and Inglehart. Sacred and Secular is the book, and this is from the chapter, I think it's on democracy. So if you want to go and read up about this, it's actually a really good book, a really good place to start. And the final point I'm going to make today is a similar thing, right? This is from a study from Breslau and friends, and they looked at data from 86 countries, and their basic hypothesis was, we're going to look to see if this clash of civilizations thesis is accurate, right? We're going to look and see, measure religious attitudes around the world on democracy, see what people think, and basically we're going to test this particular viewpoint. They looked at data from 86 countries, and they did not find any evidence that there was a clash of civilizations. Protestants were slightly more supportive of religious leaders being involved in politics than Muslims. So the ranking was Protestants were first, then Muslims, then Catholics, and at the bottom were the non-religious. But the interesting thing about this study was that the biggest divide in terms of attitudes towards democracy was not between people from different religious denominations, but between religious and non-religious individuals. So the gap here was not between religions, but between the religious and the secular. And that is where I am going to leave it for today. So as ever, thanks for coming. Next week we're going to be looking at gender and sexuality. So I will see you all next time around.